This is 9/11 Freefall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of 9/11 Freefall. I am the host, Andy Steele. Tonight, I am going to be taking us back to the past, back to 2008, when NIST released its World Trade Center 7 report, and an interview conducted by the producer of this radio station that this show is on, No Lies Radio, Allan Rees, with lead investigator of that NIST report, Shyam Sunder. In this interview, he talks with Sunder about the report that was just released, about some of the evidence points that were available at that time. And this is a really good interview. I'm actually surprised with myself that I did not know that this interview existed until this week. I listened to it first in the car driving down south, and I knew I had to play it here on this show. I had to archive this great interview in the history with all of the great interviews that have been conducted here on this show. Allan has some really good skills, too, as a journalist, asking some of the tough questions. So the interview itself is about a half an hour long, but I'm going to be breaking in at various points and talking about some of the things that Sunder is saying in that back and forth. And the plan is to have Allan on the show next week as the guest to talk about that interview, talk about other things related to 9/11 truth. So this is the beginning of a two-part series, looking back first at the interview with Shyam Sunder conducted back in 2008, and then, of course, talking about Allan's reflections on that here in 2016. So that was about 8 years ago that this interview took place. So I'll be playing that for you in just a few moments. Stay tuned.
The views expressed on this show by guests and the host on issues outside of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence are the opinions of those individuals alone and do not necessarily reflect those of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
All right, folks, as promised, we are going to be playing that interview for you. Again, this is Allan Rees, is the person conducting the interview. Shyam Sunder is the guest. He was the lead investigator on the World Trade Center 7 report. And like I said, I'll be breaking in at various points during this interview to offer my own commentary on some of the things that are said. So let's get it started.
On Thursday, August 21st, 2008, No Lies Radio brought you live coverage of the NIST World Trade Tower No. 7 final report on its collapse. And we also brought you live the same day, right afterwards, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth's Counter News Conference, which explained how the NIST report was in error. On that day, No Lies Radio was granted an exclusive interview with Dr. Sunder, who presented the NIST report in the news conference and who was also the lead investigator in the World Trade Tower Center disasters. You do not want to miss this interview. It follows right now. We're pleased that you've consented to this interview. We're a Pacifica Radio Network affiliate station based in Northern California, and we carried your news conference live this morning.
Okay.
And
that's wonderful.
Just for the benefit of our audience, I'm going to tell them that they may not have heard it, that you presented the National Institute and Standards of Technology NIST report for the reasons of the collapse of the World Trade Center Building No. 7 on September 11th, 2001.
Yeah.
And also for the benefit of our audience, World Trade Tower No. 7 was a 47-story building that fell nearly 7 hours after the World Trade Tower Centers collapsed, and it was not hit by an airplane. Your website states that your report on the World Trade Tower Center's collapse for No. 7 was completed over a 3-year period, and it presents the probable collapse sequence for the buildings. and provides recommendations, of course. It also states that you're the director of the Building and Fire Research Laboratory, and you're the lead investigator for the Federal Building and Fire Safety Investigation into the World Trade Center disasters, that you oversee NIST activities as the lead agency for the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program, and that you co-chair the National Science and Technologies Council Subcommittee on Building Technology. Did I get all that right?
That's very accurate and comprehensive.
Cool. Could you please tell our listening audience what your doctorate is in, how long have you been with NIST, and how did you happen to become the lead investigator in the World Trade Tower disaster?
Well, my doctorate is in structural engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and that goes back to 1981. And I was on the faculty of MIT Civil Engineering Department from 1981 through 1994, at which point I joined NIST in the Building and Fire Research Laboratory as a manager for work on high-performance construction materials. And over time, I became chief of the Structures Division at NIST. This is a division that does research on structures that leads to improved building codes and standards and practices, and of course, in the past has conducted investigations of many key failures and building collapses that we've seen in this country, including the Hyatt Regency walkway collapse in Kansas City in the early 80s. Okay. And, of course, my staff here and I have had published extensively in our areas of expertise.
Okay. And so then how did you become the lead investigator for the WTC disasters?
Well, when 9/11 happened, I was the chief of the Structures Division, and clearly as an expert in the field and as the experts in the entire professional community in the country, we were really concerned we wanted to get to understanding why and how these buildings collapsed, whether the loss of life was high or low, and we wanted to understand if there are any lessons to be derived in terms of improvements to building safety and codes and standards for the future. Now, clearly recognizing that what happened on 9/11 was triggered by terrorist attacks, and these were not normal events for which we designed buildings, nor that we should be designing buildings for such terrorist attacks, because that would be incredibly cost prohibitive. So, as chief of the Structures Division, I and my colleagues here at NIST were in close touch with the professional community, and it became very clear in the initial months that there was a study that was ongoing, funded by the Federal Emergency Management Agency under the leadership of the American Society of Civil Engineers. And it became clear among the experts working on that study that a more comprehensive and thorough investigation was needed. At the same time, we had families of the victims who had lost loved ones on 9/11 who wanted to really understand the same questions that the technical community wanted answered. And, of course, they wanted to know if there was anything wrong in the building construction, if the buildings themselves were not adequately performing on 9/11. And as a result of that interest, the Congress, through its House Committee on Science and Technology, held hearings in the spring of 2002, and the end of that did three things. One, it directed NIST to conduct an investigation. Two, it actually appropriated $16 million of one-time supplemental funding for our laboratory to carry out that investigation. And third, they actually passed a new law that gives us the authority, a more comprehensive authority, to carry out these kind of building and fire safety investigations.
Oh,
that's how we got started.
That's great. Okay, now, we have a lot of listeners, that you would believe in the conspiracy theory, okay, that the buildings were brought down by controlled demolition.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm not going to pull any punches. I'm going to ask you some straight-out questions, and I hope you'll answer me.
I'll answer them to the best of my ability.
Very good. Now, I've been told that, and actually I have citations for this, but Mark Lazo, president of Controlled Demolition, who was hired for the Building 7 cleanup. Are you familiar with him?
Yes.
Okay. He is quoted as saying that molten steel was found at World Trade Tower number 7. Leslie Robertson, the World Trade Center structural engineer, stated on October 5th, 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten steel was still running. Fire department personnel were recorded on video reporting seeing molten steel running down the channel rails like they're in a foundry, like lava from a volcano. Joe O'Toole, a Bronx firefighter, saw a crane lifting a steel beam vertically from deep within the pile. He said it was dripping from molten steel. Bart Borzanger, an architect who is saving relics from the rubble, stated that he found a multi-ton meteorite that was a fused element of molten steel and concrete. Now, in your investigation, did you interview Mark Lazo, Leslie Robertson, Joe O'Toole regarding their eyewitness testimony of molten steel?
Well, by the way, we definitely talked to Mark Lazo and Leslie Robertson over the course of this investigation. But most importantly, there's a big difference between finding molten steel in the pile, the rubble pile, from between that and finding and extrapolating that to say that the steel, when the building was still standing and the fires were occurring in the building, that in fact the steel was melting. There's a big difference for one very simple reason. Fires when in the buildings when they were standing were actually for the most part, due to the office furnishings in that building. And the temperatures to which office furnishings get to is normally on the order of about 1100 degrees Celsius. Steel melts at about 16 or 1700 degrees Celsius. So the steel, when the building was still standing, whether it's office furnishings burning or even hydrocarbon burning, which would be the jet fuel, the average air temperatures would not exceed around 11 or 1200 degrees, which is substantially less than the temperatures required to melt steel. However, when you go to the bottom of the building after the buildings have collapsed and you have shielding of the fires due to the rubble pile on top of it, the radiation is contained within the shielded region, and therefore the temperatures can exceed that which you would see in an office fire or a hydrocarbon fire when the buildings were standing and the windows were broken or there was gas from the airplane, so it's a well-ventilated fire. So in the case of a shielded fire, it is entirely possible, when the steel was in the rubble pile itself, that parts of the steel could have melted.
Okay, I want to just jump in here and address that. I checked with physics professors about this, and my first instinct upon hearing Shyam Sunder say this is that, and actually I should even jump back just to clarify and make sure everybody understood what Mr. Sunder's argument here is, because a lot of that gets broken up because of poor audio. So essentially what Shyam Sunder is saying is that the steel that was reported melted. First of all, NIST hasn't really even acknowledged that there was melted steel. John Gross denied it, denied all of the eyewitness testimony of that. You can see that in AE 9/11 Truth's movie, Blueprint for Truth, where there's an entire montage of John Gross saying that he's seen no evidence of melted steel and various people at the scene reporting it. But that's John Gross. We're talking about Shyam Sunder. Shyam Sunder leaves the door open and says, well, maybe there could have been melted steel there, but there was none while it was falling. What happened, or what could have happened if there was melted steel, and this is his argument, is that the fires could have been shielded by debris, and that would have made it get hotter, and that would have increased the temperatures to the point where it would melt the steel, and that's what all these first responders could be talking about. Problem with that is, in my first instinct, and I've checked with people who know about these kinds of things is that a shielded fire like this in a rubble pile would have to be oxygen starved. If it's covered, you're essentially putting out the fires. Now, there were fires still burning for weeks afterwards. That's a sign of something else, such as the nanothermic residue found in the World Trade Center dust. But if everything is on the up and up, and everything that we are being told by NIST is true, and this was simply caused by the jet fuel and the fires that we witnessed on that day, then those fires should be oxygen starved. They shouldn't get to the temperatures needed to melt the steel. Now, again, I'm not a fire expert, but I have checked with people, and that just seems to be common sense. So at least Sunder doesn't go to the point where he says, oh, there was no melted steel. He doesn't just dismiss the testimony of all of the people who spoken at that point. But the explanation that he gives here, when you have a covered fire like that, if there's no oxygen getting to it, which is essentially what you would have to have at this point with all the rubble covering it, then how could it get hot enough to melt the steel in the pile? So that's a question that we need to address and get Allan's point of view on, and other people who come on this show, people who are experts on these kinds of things. That's something that Mr. Sunder should be asked if you see him speaking in any events, or if we get a chance to correspond with him. Again, he's just taking a shot in the dark. It's not really basing it off of any kind of evidence. And you'll hear that a lot in this interview tonight. It's like Congressman Christopher Smith, when asked about the Twin Towers, and he says, well, there might have been corners cut in construction. I don't know, but maybe. And you find people do this a lot when they're trying to explain away the evidence. They try to come up with all these potential hypotheticals without actually looking at the evidence itself and trying to do any kind of follow-through with it. How does NIST deal with the nanothermic residue that was found in the World Trade Center dust by the team of scientists led by Niels Harrit? Well, they don't. They just refuse to look for it. So whereas a real scientific investigation would look into that, instead they just try to come up with some explanation without any real testing for it, like this right here. The shielded fire might have caused the melted steel. You say you found it. Okay, well, I don't know. Maybe this happened. Who knows? I'm not going to investigate it any further. So this is just an explanation that doesn't really have any basis behind it. It's just something he's throwing out there. And it doesn't make sense on its face, as I explained earlier. All right, we're going to continue the interview.
But you're not denying that there was melted steel then?
Well, in the rubble pile, there certainly could have been melted steel, but that doesn't. But the bulk of the steel samples that we got, and we had over 200 major pieces of steel, particularly from the towers, and we were able to identify several of them in the direct impact region of the airplane impact in Building 1. That we did not see any evidence of any molten steel on those particular elements that we have here on our campus.
Well, what about sulfidated steel? On page 33 of Beyond Misinformation, there's a section that says sulfidated steel in WTC7. It reads, in a New York Times article published in February of 2002, James Glanz and Eric Lipton wrote, perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation involves extremely thin bits of steel collected from 7 World Trade Center. The steel apparently melted away, but no fire in any of the buildings was believed to be hot enough to melt steel outright. A preliminary analysis at Worcester Polytechnic Institute suggests that sulfur released during the fires, no one knows from where, may have combined with atoms in the steel to form compounds that melt at lower temperatures. Beyond Misinformation narrative continues. The WPI professors, who were shocked by the Swiss cheese appearance of the steel, reported their analysis in Appendix C of the FEMA Building Performance Study, making the following recommendation. And it said, the severe corrosion and subsequent erosion of samples 1 and 2 are a very unusual event. No clear explanation for the source of the sulfur has been identified. A detailed study into the mechanisms of this phenomenon is needed. Beyond misinformation, narrative continues. A simple explanation for the source of the sulfur, as well as the high temperature corrosion and erosion, is thermate, which is produced when sulfur is added to thermite. And there you have a picture of John Gross. He was the investigator on the WTC-7 report for NIST, standing there in his blue jeans and white construction hat, next to a piece of the Swiss cheese steel. All right, he's posing next. It says there's a caption: posing next to the eroded sulfated steel. NIST would later claim that no identifiable steel was recovered from World Trade Center 7, and John Gross would deny the existence of molten metal. This single piece of steel that John Gross is standing by, posing by, in this picture should have been a red flag for NIST. So there's no credibility to what Shyam Sunder is saying right now. They should have looked into this.
So you found no molten steel on the evidence samples that you have. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, but back to my original question. Did you interview these witnesses who saw molten steel?
Yes, we have talked to lots of people, eyewitnesses, including, as I said, Les Robertson and Mark Lazo.
Did you take their statements about molten steel?
Well, we did not carry out this is a technical investigation. It's not a criminal investigation.
Well, that has nothing to do with crime. I'm not saying who did this. It's molten steel. It's evidence as to what happened.
Yeah, and of course we asked for information. We talked to witnesses. We have talked to over 500 over 100 first responders from the Fire Department of New York, the Police Department, the Port Authority Police Department, the Emergency Response Teams. We've talked to we have conducted over 1,000 interviews of surviving occupants. And some of these interviews, many of these interviews have exceeded 2 or 3 hours apiece, particularly those with the first responders or the emergency responders and the face-to-face interviews that we carried out with surviving occupants.
Mm-hmm. Are those interviews public record? Are they within the record?
The findings of all of those interviews have been summarized in our reports and have been made public.
How about the actual interviews?
The actual interviews have had non-disclosure agreements because that was the conditions under which institutional review board conditions, or when you have human subjects being interviewed, mm-hmm. The scientific basis for doing them is you have to give them the opportunity for anonymity as part of their interview process.
Okay, that is so bizarre for him to say that, because why would it have to be anonymous? I don't understand that if it's a scientific investigation and not a criminal one. So, and you notice earlier he dodges the question about whether or not they took in any of the reports of the melted steel from the people that reported it by saying, well, this is not a criminal investigation. This is just an investigation into what happened to the buildings. Allan properly points out that still is a key of what happened. It still gives you a clue as to what happened, even if you're not looking at who did it. It doesn't matter how many hours they spoke to someone. It matters about the relevant information. And if you're just ignoring information that doesn't support your hypothesis, which it appears NIST is doing in this interview, or is doing in its report, rather, then that's not real science.
Now, do you know whether Mark Lazo or Leslie Robertson or Joe O'Toole were interviewed as to molten steel?
Well, as I said, there is no evidence that there was steel molten in the building when it was standing. There's no way that you could have had molten steel in the building when it was standing. And if you're alluding to the molten metal that was seen on the northeast corner of the 82nd or 81st floor of Tower 2, some minutes before the building collapsed, that was a isolated incident where molten material, not molten steel, molten material was seen coming out. It was a silverish color molten material.
Okay.
That is just plain not true. What he's referring to here is the molten metal coming out of the South Tower on the morning of 9/11. It's been documented. It's streaming liquid metal coming down, and he's saying that it's silver, and that it's aluminum from the airplane. And indeed, if it was aluminum from the airplane, it would be silver, but Google it for yourself. Google molten metal falling from South Tower 9/11 and ask yourself, is that silver? You will clearly see that it is not. It is bright orange. Why does this matter? Because molten aluminum, which, again, Shyam Sunder is claiming that this is from the airplane and other parts of the building, perhaps, is silver in daylight conditions. Again, September 11th was a bright blue Tuesday morning, daylight conditions. But this metal coming out is not silver, it is bright orange. All right, a simple Google search can confirm this. So Shyam Sunder is dead wrong. This is deceptive. This is an outright, bold-faced lie.
And this is the same floor where the airplane crashed into the building. Yeah. Airplanes are made of aluminum, and of course you also know that the skin of the World Trade Center towers was made of aluminum.
Okay, so let's get back to the molten steel in the pile, though. Now you're saying that the fact that it was in the pile could have heated the temperatures up. Now I've talked to physicists and told me that actually violates the laws of physics, that it can't heat up because there's no source for the energy.
We disagree. I think you need to talk to experts who do this for a living.
Okay.
Okay, that's not an argument. That's not an argument that we just disagree and you need to talk to experts because he did talk to people. As Allan said. Allan said he did talk to people who, experts on this, professors, I believe he just said. And to simply just write off what Allan is reporting from them is not a refutation. It's just essentially patronizing dismissal.
All right. Next question. Last year, physicist Stephen Jones and two other physicists and a geologist analyzed the slag at the end of the beams. And they found iron, aluminum, sulfur, manganese, and fluorine, the chemical evidence for thermate, a high-tech incendiary cutting charge used by the military. The byproduct of thermite is molten iron. Now, in your investigation, did you interview these physicists or examine their evidence and findings?
No, we did not.
Why not?
And for a very simple reason. We looked at all of the alternative hypotheses that were being presented. We looked at so we considered all of the possible hypotheses, and then we made a technical judgment in terms of what would actually be a credible hypothesis. And among the credible hypotheses we identified were the diesel fuel that was stored to power up the emergency generators in the building, the transfer elements, transfer trusses, girders, and overhangs that were in the building because the office building was built on top of an electric substation. And third, we wanted to look at hypothetical blast events because there was some suggestion, though we had not seen any evidence of it, that the manner in which Building 7 seemed to collapse was similar in some features to a controlled demolition.
Reading again from Beyond Misinformation, page number 39 this time, under the section Hypothetical Blast Scenarios and Thermite Use, it says, the only substantive analysis that NIST performed regarding the hypothesis of controlled demolition was its consideration of hypothetical blast scenarios for the destruction of World Trade Center 7 carried out under a contract with Applied Research Associates beginning in August 2006. NIST analysis started with identifying a hypothetical blast event involving the minimum amount of explosive material required to fail Column 79. It determined that to be a linear-shaped charge consisting of 9 pounds of RDX. From there, it performed analysis to assess how much window breakage and noise would result, and whether it was feasible for someone to plant such explosives in the building. NIST concluded the following. The minimum charge required to fail a critical column would have produced a pressure wave that would have broken windows on the north and east faces of the building near column 79. The visual evidence did not show such breakage. The noise level at a distance of half a mile would have been on the order of 130 dB to 140 dB. People on the street would have heard 9 pounds of RDX go off a mile away. And preparations for a blast scenario would have been almost impossible to carry out on any floor in the building without detection. NIST's analysis of hypothetical blast scenarios is a textbook example of strawman tactics, where an argument is constructed and then refuted to give the impression that an opponent's argument has been defeated, when in fact the refuted argument is not the opponent's. Proponents of the controlled demolition hypothesis have seldom, if ever, argued that a high explosive such as RDX was used to destroy WTC-7. Rather, as the evidence examined in Chapter 5 strongly suggests, the leading hypothesis is that an explosive form of thermite called nanothermite, possibly in combination with some form of explosives and other incendiaries, was used to destroy World Trade Center 7. Using nanothermite instead of the more powerful RDX would allow a perpetrator to demolish a building while concealing the fact that he had planted explosives. Even though NIST was fully aware of nanothermite technology and knew that the leading hypothesis of controlled demolition involved some form of thermite, as evidenced by its FAQ, it selected a strawman substance, RDX, for its hypothetical blast event. Thus, its analysis of the window breakage and the noise associated with RDX are irrelevant, and the technology exists for nanothermite cutter charges, as Richard Gage noted when he was on C-SPAN's Washington Journal a couple of years ago.
Beyond that, we looked at clearly the information about alternative theories beyond these 3 or 4 that I just mentioned, and did not feel that any of them were credible enough in our technical judgment.
Okay, now, National Fire Protection Association, NFPA 921, Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigations, dictates in a fire investigation that certain residues be tested for. Shouldn't you have tested those residues that Stephen Jones has found, according to your own dictates?
No. As I said before, the process we followed was very systematic. We looked at possible hypotheses. We decided technically what would muster to be a credible hypothesis, and then we proceeded to investigate those credible hypotheses more in detail.
Well, that's convenient and easy. They can just make a technical judgment and decide what hypotheses are credible and what are not without having to justify it. Ignore all of the evidence, ignore the recommendations of NFPA 921, and simply just determine that there's no credibility to the evidence, even though it exists and there's a lot of credibility to it. Look into straw man arguments about RDX, but don't look into nanothermite and the patents on the technology for shape charges. So this is just, again, hiding behind credentials and hiding behind an argument of appeal to authority rather than looking at the evidence.
The hypotheses that we deemed not to be credible, we decided were hypotheses that needed way more information to be even feasible. They are not even feasible. Just because thermite or thermate exists in some dust particles does not necessarily translate into thermate being the cause of the building failure. There's no theory around it. There's just observations, isolated observations.
Well, there's actually a peer-reviewed paper that was put out by Niels Harrit and his team that NIST has failed to even refute or address. So, no, this is not just a theory and people's crazy people on the internet going into flights of fancy here. This is actually science, a peer-reviewed paper laid out. It's been available for years, and it really hasn't been refuted.
Okay. Now, the World Trade Center 7 catastrophic structural failure, according to a lot of people, shows every characteristic of a controlled demolition. Now, there were first responders who reported explosions occurring about a second before the collapse, and there was a symmetrical near freefall collapse through the path of greatest resistance. So how could a building fall through itself through the path of greatest resistance? Doesn't that violate one of the 5th grade laws of physics that I learned? And that would also require that all the columns would have to be cut within a fraction of a second of each other. And how could your fire theory cut all the columns within a second of each other in order for the building to fall down in a free fall speed? And then there is expert testimony from demolition experts that they believe it's a controlled demolition. Did you interview any of these people?
Well, what you said right now, the 4 or 5 things that you said in quick succession without even allowing me to answer and clarify your question.
Go right ahead, sir. I'm sorry.
Which you interrupted my asking a clarification.
Go ahead.
Let me just say that those things, what you just said, the collection of things you said, do not add up to a theory. They add up to simply pure and simple speculation.
No, Danny Joanko saying it's a controlled demolition when he was a controlled demolition expert is not speculation. The evidence that we've cited time and time again is not speculation. This is just a tactic, all right? When you're up against the wall, just deny and lie. And that is what I see happening here in this case. You know, free fall acceleration, Allan says speed, it's free fall acceleration for 105 feet, which wasn't admitted to until David Chandler embarrassed NIST at their own technical briefing. That is an evidence point. The idea that you would have a building fall straight down symmetrically at free fall acceleration for 105 feet itself, based off of a few thermally expanding beams in the corner of the building, is an extraordinary event. That is more speculation, more theorizing than what's done by AE 9/11 Truth and all the experts that it represents. So Sunder is wrong here. Good for Allan to bring up all of these points, and again, to just say that it's speculation, to just dismiss it and say there's nothing to it when you can't do anything with it, when you refuse to address it, is just a dodging technique. It's just a way of getting through the moment so that you don't have to address any of these evidence points and continue pretending that your thermal expansion theory actually holds any water.
Now, what about the video and the audio footage and eyewitnesses to the fact that there was foreknowledge that the World Trade Tower number 7 was going to collapse? Firefighters and emergency response personnel were overheard giving an actual countdown just prior to the time the building collapsed. The BBC reported the collapse 20 minutes prior to the collapse. Did you interview any of these response personnel and take their testimony? Did you interview the BBC? How they could have known the building was going to collapse? We are aware that an engineer or a technical expert or a technical advisor was providing advice to the city agencies with regard to the condition of Building 7. The advice really was focused on whether or not firefighting operations should be continued in Building 7, given the fact that by this time over 400 first responders had already died on ground zero due to the collapse of the towers, and whatever remaining resources were there were being directed to other buildings where fires were ongoing. So it was the judgment of this advisor or advisors that the buildings eventually would come down because of what they were observing in terms of the fires in the building and the creaking noises that they heard. And that is entirely consistent with the damaging of connections and buckling of beams in the floor system. This decision to stop firefighting operations in Building 7 was made around probably around 2 to 30, somewhere in that time frame. And beyond that time frame, there was no firefighting operations anywhere near that building. And, of course, the building eventually did collapse at 5:20. So clearly there was some advice that was given, and that is entirely appropriate for advice to be obtained by city agencies to make decisions that are life and death for their employees. I can understand that. Can you identify that personnel? That person?
Well, again, that is not, the identification of persons and personnel is not really the issue. When we talk about our findings, we're talking about pretty credible people who have talked to us, pretty credible evidence we have, and are documented in our report. So you're going to have to read our report.
We'll definitely read the report.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is really important, and I'm glad I listened to this again while I'm recording this, because this is absurd. All right, so the story he's going with is that some unknown engineer, I guess from the city, told the deputy fire chief that the building was going to come down, supposedly creaking noises. I've even heard it said, too, from somebody that there was a bulge, but there's no evidence of this bulge, and Tony Zambotti was the one who told me about that. He's looked into this deeply. He's found no evidence of a bulge, but supposedly some engineer came to the deputy fire chief and said, oh, this building is going to come down, and this deputy fire chief, who had just watched all of his fellow firefighters die in the Twin Towers and probably didn't want to risk losing any more, might have been a little more susceptible, that's my own personal speculation, psychologically to that kind of warning, and they had the firefighters not in the building fighting these fightable fires at the time it came down, and thankfully so. No, we didn't lose any firefighters in World Trade Center 7. But notice how Allan asks Shyam Sunder if they could identify who said that. Did NIST show any interest in talking to this person that came and warned the fire department that the building was going to come down? And Sunder shows no interest. He can't identify who that is. He's citing them. He's citing some unidentified person. Some guy told the fire chief, I don't know. What kind of evidence is that? What kind of scientist just cites what he heard some guy say? All right, I heard that somebody said. That's not science. And wouldn't they have an interest in locating this person? Again, if this person is in some kind of official capacity, it seems like they could be identified with a few phone calls. Shouldn't be that hard if they're working for an official body like the city or whoever it was. If they were speaking with some authority and telling the fire department what to do. So they wouldn't have any interest in talking to this person and finding out who this was? I mean, they interview experts to stand there after the fact and maybe watch some videos and look at NIST's computer models that they won't release the input data of and give their opinion on what might have happened. But you're not interested in talking to somebody that was there on the scene? Somebody that was giving this advice to the fire department, not tracking them down and saying, okay, hey, look, we got to put together this official report. A lot of people are upset about the destruction of the buildings on 9/11. A lot of people have questions about Building 7. We want to make sure we get it right. You were there. Why did you make that assessment? Why did you think the building was going to come down? My God, the amount of intel they could have gotten from that. And to this day, NIST could point to the person and say, hey, this is the guy. These are his credentials. He was there, and this is what he saw and why he made that judgment, and this is why we're right. But he shows no interest whatsoever in this engineer that he's citing to get through the moment, to essentially put something up there. All right. I used to do that when I was a kid in elementary school. I was not a very good student, so I just wouldn't do my homework. So you just, answer the math problems to get it done, and when the teacher's asking for it and hand it up to her. I became a better student later on. But back in the day, I wasn't. And you just get through the moment. You just put any answer down just to get through that awkward moment where they're expecting your homework. This is what Shyam Sunder's doing right now. And I don't think it's as sloppy as just coming up with something off the top of his head. I think that this is just something that has been accepted by people defending the official story without any real thought behind it. When you try to put some real questions to this explanation, put any thought into this answer, then you just get called a conspiracy theorist.
Definitely read the report.
Yeah.
Okay, and okay. Now, one more question here. Larry Silverstein, the lesser of the all three World Trade Center buildings, carried a multi-billion-dollar insurance policy in all three World Trade Center buildings, which was just purchased only months prior to their collapse. And he was shown on TV stating that he and the fire department decided to pull building number 7, and then the building collapsed. Pull is an industry term for controlled demolition. Did you interview Mr. Silverstein or the personnel in the fire department who decided to pull building 7?
Well, let me again explain to you the charter of our investigation. And maybe you asked me this question before, or maybe you did not. We are chartered by Congress to determine why and how the buildings collapsed. We're chartered by Congress to determine whether the loss of life was high or low. We're chartered, really, the purpose behind our investigations is not to find blame, but it's on fact-finding to improve building safety in this country. And our focus really is on nothing more than the technical aspects of what happened on 9/11. And what we have done is relied as technical experts, and as we all believe in the science field, our main focus is to base our findings on sound science. To the extent that we have sound science or statistically relevant interviews, that makes sense. But just anecdotally talking to individuals is not the basis on which we derive robust scientific-based findings.
So you did not interview Mr. Silverstein then?
We do not have to or need to interview folks who had anecdotal information. We relied more on the hard evidence in terms of photos, videos, design drawings, and other design documents that we have.
Okay. All right. One final question here. There's over 400 architects and engineers that put their reputation on the line in opposing your report. Why would they do this? Would you allow your expert staff and their experts to collaborate on the evidence that you have found and the evidence that they have found, or to perhaps hold a public discussion
we really
on TV?
Yeah, we really do not think that would be productive. We have this.
Notice how fast he tries to answer that even before Allan's done talking. He doesn't want any part of talking to anybody that's going to challenge their story.
A public comment process.
Okay.
Our public comment, the reports are on our website. They can be downloaded, and the public comment process will close at noon on September 15th.
I understand.
And, of course, we will look at the public comments and determine whether or not any changes need to be made to our findings and recommendations based on those public comments.
So you're still open to changes based on the public comments, is that correct?
We are formally going through a public comment period.
And after the public comment period is over, I guess your investigation ceases, is that correct?
After our public comment period is over, the investigation is complete, and of course our work is not complete. We will be, by statute, required to promote the adoption of our recommendations in practice for future building codes and standards.
Okay, and then once it's complete...
and of course, we also have a statutory research role, and we'll be carrying out that research role as well.
Okay. Now, I have friends who work in high-rise buildings, and according to what I heard this morning, it seems like very small fires in buildings can cause their total and complete collapse in a matter of 10 seconds. So would you recommend to the American public, if there's any kind of fire in a high-rise building, they should get out of that building in 10 seconds?
Absolutely not.
Why not?
That's not exactly what we said in our report. What we said in our report was that these were not minute fires. They were substantial fires, uncontrolled building fires on 6 floors that persisted for close to 7 hours.
Okay, should firefighters fight these fires in the future because the buildings could collapse? Let's say they got a building in San Francisco with 7 floors engaged. Should they allow the building to be engulfed and collapse, or should they go in there and fight it?
Well, as we said in our report, one of the most important things we could do to prevent this collapse would have been is the fact that if the sprinkler system had the water supply from the city mains, and the city mains had been cut off because the collapse of the towers damaged them. So had the city mains still supplied water to the sprinkler system in the bottom half of the buildings, those buildings would likely have still be standing today.
Okay, that doesn't even address what Allan is asking him, because again, this is the first time a steel frame high-rise has ever collapsed due to a fire. And now, according to the new theories, the whole thing can come down regardless of the sprinklers. These things burn. I mean, you see this happen with these high-rises in other countries, and even here, they light up like a torch in the night. They leave out this steel frame skeleton afterwards, but the building doesn't come crashing down. These fires I'm citing in these other buildings are far worse than what was being experienced in World Trade Center 7. Sunder would have you think that this was just this insane, out-of-control fire happening on these floors that caused these thermal expansion and the whole thing to fall, but it wasn't. In fact, the photographic evidence shows the fires were burned out an hour before in the area of collapse initiation, the area where they say the collapse started. So there's a problem with this. And again, with their theory and what Allan's bringing up is that according to NIST's explanation, firefighters fighting these fightable fires would be in grave danger fighting them. So let's continue.
But I was told the sprinklers were working at the top because it had its own separate water supply.
Yeah, the top of the building had according to the building code, and both the top and the bottom were consistent with the New York City building code. In the top of the building, you had the primary water supply from the overhead tanks and the secondary water supply from the city main. In the bottom half of the building, the primary water supply was from the city main, and the secondary water supply was actually from the city main but pumped using fire pumps. So that is consistent with what the New York City building code requires. Now, obviously, we have made a recommendation where we feel that it's important to increase the reliability of sprinkler systems by ensuring that the primary and the secondary water supply sources are not the same.
Okay, I understand. And would you, I guess this will be my final question since you brought up the sprinklers. Were the sprinklers operating in the top of the building in Building 7?
From the fact that many of the fires in the top floors, floors 20 and above, there were a total of 10 floors and fires, of which I said 6 were in the lower floors. Of the 4 others, probably 3 were in the 20 and higher range. Those fires were actually put out over time. We didn't see much of any fires after about mid-afternoon. And the only conclusion we can draw, they're probably twofold. One, that the fires somehow extinguished themselves by themselves, and 2, that the sprinkler systems provided water to them and put them out.
Okay, so it's a good possibility that the sprinklers did put them out.
That's correct.
Okay. All right, and I want to thank you for this interview, and I think our listeners will be quite interested in hearing what you had to say from your point of view. And I hope that maybe we can do this again in the future at some point, maybe after your findings are out, and discuss this thing further.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Okay, so there you go. Allan Rees' interview with Shyam Sunder back in 2008. Flashback to yesteryear. So I offered some commentary during this interview, my own thoughts on it. I'm sure there's a lot more I could say if I listened to it a few more times, but I think that's something that needs to be highlighted here is how Shyam Sunder kept on going back to the notion that this is not a criminal investigation. We're just doing a technical investigation. It came up once when he was talking about Larry Silverstein, when Allan asked him about him, with him the pullet comment, which I don't get into too much on this show simply because they can throw up these explanations. Oh, he didn't really mean to pull the building. He meant to pull the firefighters out, even though the firefighters were already out of the building, and turns into this squabbling about what he really meant when he said that. I don't like that, so I don't go there. But he also brought that up earlier. I believe it was when they were talking about molten metal. Yeah, when they were talking about molten metal. Now, the molten metal is an important part of figuring out why Building 7 went down. So that was a misstep on Shyam Sunder's part by even saying that. But you notice that there's this deflection of responsibility and this appeal to credentials as well throughout all of this. This is what NIST does. They claim that there is no evidence when there's plenty of evidence. And I guess it's up to the audience to decide for themselves. They say that metal seen streaming out of flowers when it came down was silvery, and you look at it for yourself and you see that it's bright orange. Who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the guy who is being pushed out to you as the expert, or the guy in your own head? I mean, believe your own eyes. What are you actually seeing? It's just like that video. This is an orange. All right, you see an orange, you visually identify it, but somebody tells you an apple. Are you going to believe the guy telling you it's an apple, or are you just going to believe your own eyes and say, no, that is an orange? So listening to this, I haven't come to any more of a conclusion of what happened other than NIST is covering up. It's overlooking observable facts. This is why we need to have a new investigation. I think the nature of what NIST was seeking to do is captured in the fact that they are unwilling to look at this again. That Shyam Sunder was so quick to dismiss the idea of talking to any other building experts, even if new evidence comes out, something else gets discovered over the following years, after their time for public comment is closed. They're not open to talking to anybody about this after the public comment time was finished. That's very telling. It shows that they were simply looking to give an explanation to the public, something that could be cited, something that could be held up as a shield when politicians are asked about this. Usually politicians don't even know much about this issue, the greatest mass murder in U.S. history. They always cite the 9/11 Commission, when really they should be citing the NIST report for their obfuscation and cover. But they shouldn't be citing the NIST report for the sake of truth. They should be citing the evidence cited by architects and engineers for 9/11 truth, if you really want to get into it. But regardless, they're not open to anything new, even when you find flaws in their report. Again, Tony Zambodi and his team discovered missing structural features. Folks, this is a problem. This is why we exist. This is why we need a new investigation, even 15 years after the event took place, 8 years after that report was released, because we don't have an explanation of what happened to Building 7 beyond what our own common sense and all of the evidence that NIST refuses to acknowledge or look at points to, which is that Building 7 and, of course, the Twin Towers, as you expanded out, were brought down in controlled demolitions on that day. I'm going to have Allan Rees on the show next week to talk about this interview, his own thoughts on it. So it's going to conclude this episode of 9/11 Free Fall. Remember, you can hear this program every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also keep track of the archives by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.